If I were getting the job, it probably would.
Okay, we've gone past time, so I think we'll get started, even though one of our guests has disappeared. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm a program associate at the Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. A few words about the center, for those of you who don't know. The Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to President Wilson. President Wilson was, of course, the only president to have a PhD, and so the Wilson Center honors his legacy as a scholar and a politician by bringing scholars to Washington to inform policy here in the nation's capital. The Asia program, which is hosting this event, tries to take a historical and contemporary approach to Asia to inform policymakers in Washington about that region. We're also co-sponsoring this event with the History and Public Policy program here at the Center, which, as the name suggests, tries to bring to bear history on good public policy making. And incorporated in that program is the North Korea International Documentation Project, which is the director of that project, James Person, is up the back there. The project is an extremely interesting one. It takes documents from North Korea's present and former allies, translates them, edits them, collates them, and publishes them for all to see. And the program has just released a new publication, The Rise and Fall of Détente on the Korean Peninsula, 1970 to 1974. So I would encourage you all to familiarize yourselves with that program. Okay, so today we're examining memories of authoritarianism and in democratic South Korea, an extremely interesting topic, and to do so we have gathered four eminent scholars on history, historiography of South Korea and Asia in general as well. Our first speaker will be Sun-Suk Moon. She's a professor of sociology at Vassar College. She is the author of Militarized Modernity and Gendered Citizenship in South Korea, and the co-editor and primary author of Over There, Living with the U.S. Military Empire. Namhee Lee is Associate Professor of Modern Korean History at the Department of Asian Languages and Culture at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is the author of The Making of Minjung, Democracy and the Politics of Representation in South Korea. Our third speaker is Henry M. He's the Associate Professor of East Asian Studies at New York University. He was a Fulbright Senior Scholar to Korea and a recipient of the University of California President's Research Fellowship in the Humanities. He's also the author of Sovereignty and Modern Korean Historiography. And our fourth speaker is Alexis Dudden. She's a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. She's the recipient of a Fulbright Research Grant to Japan and was on the U.S.-Japan Fellowship Program at Harvard University. She's the author of Troubled Apologies Among Japan, Korea, and the United States. So, without further ado, I will pass things over to Professor Moon. Now you can sit here or use the podium. Okay, sure.
Good afternoon. I just like to thank Bryce Wakefield and other people who organized the event. In the interest of time, I'm going to start. What I'm going to talk about is the memories of authoritarianism, what kind of relevance or influence it might have on current political development. And I will be focusing on a very specific example. And the example is the upcoming Seoul mayoral by-election. it's only 2 weeks away. It will be held on the 26th of October, 2011. So let me begin with some sociological insights about collective memory. I'd like to start with a couple of things here. That here today we are talking about collective memories of authoritarianism, and I like to really highlight what kind of function memories, collective memories have. And essentially, I like to talk about two things. First thing is the role of collective memory or social memory in forming group identity. So, in other words, I'm arguing that collective memories of different sorts really can function as a mechanism by which collective identities are formed and evolving. So the role of memory as source of group cohesion or solidarity, that's one thing that I like to highlight later on. And then second point I like to make is political nature of collective memories. I mentioned here that there is always a selective remembering and forgetting. Usually we talk about memory and we just focus on what is being remembered, but there is always what is being forgotten, right? So memory is also about what is forgotten, and there is something really selective going on there. And then as a result of this kind of politics of collective memory, there are usually competing versions of memories about a particular political leader or a public event. So what matters is that, who is remembering or which group is remembering about a particular figure or a particular event, and also what are specific social and political contexts in which a particular memory are being produced and consumed. And then from these 2 points, I like to argue that there has been really production and circulation and consumption of memories about late presidents in South Korea. And the 2 late presidents that I will be focusing on today is Park Chung-hee and Roh Moo-hyun. Let's see. And my main point is that there are different sorts of memories being generated and consumed by the public. And these different memories essentially reflect the emergence and evolution of social groups in South Korea. And these groups have, different political orientations. And so, this is how I like to really make connections between collective memories and, the particular event that I'm focusing on, the by-election. All right? Let me just start with social memories of Park Chung-hee. I am building upon article that I published elsewhere, and I know we have really very limited time, so I'll try to be really concise. Just a couple of things. When we think about memories of Park Chung-hee, he has been dead for a long time. He died, very dramatically. He was assassinated back in October 1979. And then, since then, different sorts of memories were generated and consumed. And what is noteworthy about collective memories about him is that there has been really sort of quite dramatic transformation of how he was remembered by the public. So just to make a long discussion short, I would argue that the memories about him have been transformed from an authoritarian dictator to a national hero, and there were different sort of stages, in the contemporary Korean history, especially the period of democratic transition. So if I just pinpoint a few important moments in the sort of the way the nature of memory was evolving or sort of changing, I can think of few historical moments. One is during the rule of Chun Doo-hwan, who was the successor of Park Chung-hee, and during his period, the memories about Park was largely negative. He was, a brutal, authoritarian, cold-blooded, dictator. And interestingly, such memories were sort of allowed to be produced and consumed by the regime. And that this sort of negative memories begin to change by the time Roh-tae-woo became the president. So we see emergence of positive memories about Park, at least in the narrow circles of his family, his memorial society, and his hometown. And then the positive memory sort of expands further beyond the narrow circle during the rule of Kim Young-sam. And there was a real explosion of nostalgia about Park Chung-hee, particularly after the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 98. And then the following decade, where the Korean government was controlled by the so-called progressive groups, under Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, there was a sort of cultural phenomena that is named as Park Chung-hee boom or Park Chung-hee syndrome. So the analysis of the content of collective memory about Park that I will be talking about is really the analysis of popular publications on Park Chung-hee that appeared during this period. All right, so from roughly 1997-8 to 2007. All right, and then based on the publications that I analyzed, I'm just going to really skip all the details about what kind of publications I selected and how and what are the authors, just the interest of time. And I like to just highlight three themes that when you really read these popular publications that are mentioned quite often, in the mass media, I can find three recurring themes about Park Chung-hee. And one is glorifying him, and the second group is demonizing him. And then the third group is what I call humanization. And I'd like to say a few things about what is the significance of these different themes that sort of recur in these popular texts. Again, here I like to bring in, the role of sociological function of public or collective memory in group formation. So I argue that, these different sorts of memories about Park reflect formation of social groups with different political orientations in South Korea. In Korean context, it's called conservative, progressive, and then people in the middle, usually less vocal because they don't have very hot-headed feelings about Park Chung-hee. But so this is the significance that these memories really tell us, the emergence and the development, or even further evolution of these different social groups with different political orientation. And now I'd like to say a few things about Roh Moo-hyun, because he was also very much commemorated, especially after his suicide. He committed suicide in May 2009, and immediately after his suicide, and I would say the remaining 2009, there were over dozens of publications about him, mostly very much commemorative, type, and you can see, prosaic, poetic, photographic reflections of his life and legacy, and also there were biographies, written for adult and juvenile readers, and also I'm building upon my forthcoming article, which will appear in the Journal of Social Memories, which will appear in the beginning of 2013. And again, here I did a sort of critical analysis of these popular publications on Roh Moo-hyun. And there are few interesting points that emerges from this analysis. Let's see, one thing is that unlike Park Chung-hee's memories about Park Chung-hee, memories about Roh is fairly sort of uniform at this point. And it has a lot to do with the fact that he, died fairly recently, and there wasn't really a whole lot of, way development or evolution or diversification of how public remembers him. And what's really noticeable about the commemorative texts about R.O.K is that almost all of them convey certain redemptive message. So, there is something redeeming about R.O.K in their mostly positive, portrayal of him as president, or, after, he completed his presidency. And I like to say a few things about here that why there was, such a strong presence of redemption in these publications. So it's necessary to mention very briefly the social and political context of this commemoration. First, it's important to understand that R.O.K became president through sort of unprecedented grassroots movement. So initially, he enjoyed tremendous support from younger and progressive constituencies. But his supporters became deeply disappointed, and then they withdrew, or at least many of them withdrew their support from R.O.K. And then meantime, there was also the presence of criticism and ridicule made by conservative social groups in South Korea, and the main actors would be, the major conservative newspapers that have really articulated their criticism throughout his presidency. And then, what's interesting about Roh Moo-hyun is that he came with a lot of popular support, and then a lot of them got very disappointed, including his initial supporters. And then most of his presidency, he had a very low popularity. And then when he completed his presidency and then returned to his hometown, rural village, in remote Gyeongsang province, remote village in Gyeongsang province, his popularity sort of resurged. And people were sort of very much intrigued by this former president who now retired and then leading a life as a sort of rural farmer and regular citizen. And growing number of people started visiting him to see him, and then he became sort of tourist attraction. And then there were a lot of sort of publicity around this former president, leading a very ordinary life. And then also what was going on while this was happening is the investigation of the bribery scandal involving R.O.K's family, former staff, and his supporters by Lee Myung-bak's government. So people argue that or claim that this was very much politically charged investigation, and then the prosecutor's officer was diligently really leaking quite tangential informations or findings from these investigations. And then, as you know, Korea is a society very much dominated by the mass media. And then the mass media is really, eager to find some kind of entertainment for profit. So, the reporting of what's going on in Roh Moo-hyun's life, after the investigation started, became almost like a reality show. So, large number of the reporters and media journalists, they descended to Pongha village where his house is located, and then they were really reporting, almost minute by minute what's going on, in the lives of this former president. So, in a way, he his house became like a prison. He couldn't really go out, open the window freely because there is always reporter try to take picture of him or report what's going on. So he was really under enormous pressure, and then because of consistent or persistent smear campaigns done by the conservative media and the prosecutor's office, his social life and personal life became extremely confined. And then at this juncture, he committed suicide. So this is sort of like, an important social political context. And another important piece here is the way Lee Myung-bak's government handled the commemorative events organized by regular citizens. And particularly during the first week after Nomuyeon's suicide, especially from the moment of suicide to his funeral, which was observed as a national ceremony, the Lee's government showed quite repressive attitude. Like, for example, it deployed over 10,000 riot police in Seoul, and then sort of prevent people from gathering, and then closed all major public plazas and squares, so people cannot really set up the memorial altars, and also it didn't really collaborate with the people who were organizing the ceremony, even though the government agreed to hold the event as a national ceremony. And then also too many people surprised Lee Myung-bak's government didn't even allow Kim Dae-jung, the 15th president, who became old and very ailing, to give some kind of memorial speech during the funeral. So its supporters of Roe became really, really sort of sad and indignant about the whole situation. So the collective memories that we read about Roe is produced by these supporters who are really responding to this situation. And then there are three main themes emerging from the commemorative texts that I consulted. Essentially, they sort of portray him or remember him as a defiant dreamer who aspired to build a world where human beings live. Here I'm translating his own word, that he had this idea about 사람 사는 세상, and that was actually the title of his first book that he published back in 1989. And then this is also the name of website that he later created. And then these commemorators also emphasized, how he was a non-mainstream politician, and he challenged the status quo, and therefore, destroyed by conservative elites. And then they also highlight Roh Moo-hyun as a democratic president of common people, the Korean word 서민 대통령. So here again, the significance of these memories is they sort of reflect presence of different social groups, and particularly the kind of social groups who look for an egalitarian leader rather than a strong authoritarian ruler. And this presence of this kind of social group, I would argue that is a product of social change, but I guess I don't have time, so I'm going to just skip it, and I need to move quickly to the event that I wanted to focus. I don't know how many of you have been following, this event, but there will be, the mayoral by-election, Seoul mayoral by-election in 2 weeks, and I'd like to discuss briefly how, this took place. The whole thing actually began last year, 2010, when the Seoul City Council, dominated by the opposition Democratic Party, passed an ordinance that required from 2011 primary and middle schools to provide free lunch for all students, regardless of their family income. And then mayor of the ruling Grand National Party, Oh Se-hoon, he opposed this ordinance, and he made an argument that this is an example of unsustainable welfare populism. And then he sort of offered his own alternative, and that alternative says that, well, we can increase gradually this provision of free school lunch. And we only target those students whose family income lies in the bottom 50% income bracket. But the Democratic Party and then the progressive NGOs supporting the DP opposed this version, and then they argued that, well, such differentiation would stigmatize students of lower income families. And then there is this really disagreement and different opinions. So Mayor O requested a referendum on this issue. Again, there was some complicated politics here, but I'm not going into that. And when he requested this, he also pledged that he would resign if he does not get enough support from Seoul citizens. And then the reason why he sort of made this kind of gamble is to increase conservative participation in the referendum. And the referendum was done on August 24th, 2011. About a little bit less than 2 months ago. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your, political view, O did not get enough votes, and he resigned as he promised. And then, they have to replace him, and that's how mayoral by-election came about. So then now, what are the significance or relevance of memories of authoritarianism to this ongoing politics of mayoral by-election? I would make 2 points here. First point has to do with this competing view of welfare. Certainly, it began with something very specific, right? Very specific example of welfare, which is a free school lunch for students. But here we can sort of trace or at least see a potential for the development of competing views on welfare. So if I summarize, essentially Mayor O's position, which wasn't really, the GNP's position, but GNP later supported, this view. And I would call that as an authoritarian view. And that's because, let's see. In O's view, essentially school lunch is something that government will hand out to children of poor families who fail to support their own children, right? So the welfare becomes in this view, welfare becomes sort of government dole out targeted to someone who is not able to support themselves, and also in this view, the recipients of welfare they are seen as objects of passive objects of government paternalism. And if we look at DP's view on free lunch, which was really targeting all students, regardless of income, we see a kind of democratic view of welfare. And in this view, welfare is considered a basic entitlement available for all citizens. And welfare recipients are also seen as active and equal citizens who make certain contribution to society, and therefore they sort of earn, their entitlements. It's not a free handout that is given to some poor, miserable person who cannot support themselves. Okay, let's see. There are some fine points that I need to make, but the point that I really want to make here is that this discussion, which hasn't fully developed yet, but pose some interesting potential for the development of welfare debate among the Korean public, who are really getting diversified now. Okay, sort of in a way, in the process of commemorating these different political leaders. So that's sort of a connection here. I mean, there are, again, few points I really like to make, but I'm just going to leave that for the Q&A session later. And then another point that I like to make is that the rise of Park Won-soon, he's a former human rights lawyer and activist, as the unified candidate of the opposition. To begin with, he's not a politician. He is not a party member. He's really an outsider. But he, decided to run for this mayoral election, and then there was, sort of gathering of momentum, and then, he gained popular support, particularly from young generations, people who are in their 20s and 30s, and then the college-educated and white-collar workers. So again, the point here that I want to make is that, again, this presence of a social group who are looking for sort of a democratic, egalitarian, clean leader. And I would argue that presence of such social group, right, with such sensibility or something that I call post-scarcity value, is really a sort of a reflection of this ongoing the memory work that is being done among the Korean public. And just a couple of things here, and I'll stop it. It's noteworthy that when there was a referendum in August, the Oseun's version of free lunch received highest support from the resident of the most the wealthiest district in Seoul, Seocho district. And these were people who really sort of embrace, continuing economic growth, and then, they sort of distribution of resources are rather secondary. I mean, I don't argue that they don't care, but these are not the primary issue for them. And then another point is there were a series of public polls on different candidates for the by-election, and then quite consistently, younger group, more educated group, white-collar social groups, they were really showing much stronger or higher support of this Park Won-soon, and then he finally won over the let's say Democratic Party's candidate Park Young-sun. And there was sort of three mechanism that Democratic Party and the NGOs used to select the final candidate. So this is sort of how. So the essential point that I'm making is that there isn't really causality here between collective memory and what's going on now around this particular event, but there is quite interesting correlation and also the contribution of these collective memory on authoritarianism in group formation and how those groups might align or realign around different political issues. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks. Our next speaker is Namhee Lee.
Should I go up there?
You
or
can
should I
sit
do
or
it
you can
here?
use the podium.
I would also like to thank the organizers of this forum for inviting me. And I need to apologize in advance I'm going to read my presentation. I have a tendency to sidetrack. So in the interest of time, I would read the paper. And I would actually piggyback on what Professor Moon Sung-suk just talked about, which is the collective memory in South Korea. And I will be focusing on what I call the excess of memory, the rectification of history movement, and the Park Chung-hee syndrome in South Korea. Just to give you some anecdotes about what is Park Chung-hee, or what was or is Park Chung-hee syndrome. It actually began quite humorously and innocuously in March 1997 as the news of the possibility of human cloning hit South Korea. A newspaper took a poll of 180 Korea University students asking who they most wished to clone. 113 students selected Kim Gu, one of the most well-known nationalist leaders of modern Korea, while 7 students voted for Mother Teresa, and 6 students voted for former President Park Chung-hee. The fact that in the same survey, the students voted Kim Yong-sam as the least desirable figure to clone possibly indicated that they were expressing more of a dissatisfaction with the Kim Yong-sam government than positive evaluation of Park Chung-hee. However, the fact that university students whose predecessors had persistently fought against Park Chung-hee regime throughout the 1980s and carried out democratization movement for nearly 3 decades voted for Park warranted coverage by the mass media. And obviously, the many of the surveys by the newspapers show the sizable number of South Koreans believed Park Chung-hee was the president who performed his duties well and that he was one of the most respectable historical figures, etc., etc. And this is one facet of what we now call Park Chung-hee syndrome. And meanwhile, a group of people who had personally known Park Chung-hee and the First Lady announced the formation of a group called a meeting of those who admire President Park Chung-hee and First Lady Yoo Kyung-soo. A homepage on Park Chung-hee was set up on the internet by a 386 generation member. That is the group that was born in the 1960s, went to the university in the 1980s, and participated in the democratization movement while they were university students. And a series of public debates ensued in the form of academic symposia, newspaper commentaries, readers' opinions, and more intensively on the internet. And a number of prominent intellectuals argued that the syndrome was a case of Koreans' reputed penchant for forgetfulness, that Koreans basking in economic development and high incomes, this is obviously before the IMF crisis, had all but forgotten the price they had to pay to achieve the economic prosperity they now enjoyed. These intellectuals argued that an antidote to this forgetfulness was the presentation of the true history of the Park Chung-hee period. So, in other words, Germans were always arguing about how they were excessively attached to the past history. And here the Korean scholars were arguing that South Korea of the 1990s was also suffering from the same kind of excessive attachment to the past. So obviously my purpose in talking about the Park Chung-hee syndrome is not necessarily to reconstruct the course and politics of this very widely discussed phenomena, and I am not necessarily interested to substantiate or disprove the relative truth of the claims and counterclaims of historical representation of Park Chung-hee. As a historian, I am primarily interested in looking at this syndrome as a window through which to explore issues related to how South Korea's public or civil society or Koreans think about past history, especially when they are mediated by representational idioms of popular culture, and the wider questions the syndrome raises about the status of historical knowledge and its related questions on the relationship among history, public memory, and historical consciousness. So obviously the syndrome evokes a complex system of historical association where history, memory, and politics intersect and compete with contemporary debates over national identity or public policy over how to remember the past for the sake of the present and future. And this is obviously something that Professor Moon has already talked about. And as we all know, Park Chung-hee is one of the most controversial figures in post-1961 Korean history. So the questions about what Park Chung-hee represents for contemporary South Korea, his conflicting legacies, and the various meanings attributed to his politics and policies have become all the more salient and controversial for South Korea since the 1990s, and especially since the economic crisis of 1997, known as the IMF crisis. Furthermore, the questions of what Park's authoritarianism and the economic development been remembered in the context of the subsequent disappointment with the democratic reforms that also accompanied drastic measures to restructure economy. How do memories of the Yushin period that is from 1972 to 1979, shaped the response to the rebuilding democracy, and how have these memories, both collective and individual, been shaped in social changes in the broadest sense, as well as political change. So these are, of course, the reasons why I'm interested in the syndrome. And I just would like to mention that what South Korea has witnessed in the last decade or so, that is this excessive attachment to historical past or his memory, is all too familiar a history, that it is not just unique to South Korea. Historian Anne Louise Shapiro talks about contemporary society as a slightly schizophrenic moment when there is both considerable worry about historical illiteracy, cultural amnesia, and intractable presentism, the loss of meaningful history, and an equally powerful sense of history as everywhere present. And we're talking about films, museum exhibits, theme parks, etc. She states that these worries, that there is too little and too much history, are in fact not two different sets of problems, but aspects of the same larger concern, that the wrong kind of history, either wrong-headed or simply wrong, is producing an unfortunate kind of historical consciousness. As Shapiro puts it, quote, "The issue is not that people have forgotten the past, but that they misremember it too well. Not that they don't care about history, but that they don't or can't discriminate among the available burdens," unquote. So what was at stake in the ensuing public debate about the syndrome were questions about whose memories will prevail, which accounts are the most accurate, and how particular meanings are conveyed and others ignored by specific kind of representational. And one of the things that I actually argue, if I have any argument about this, is that professional or academic historians did not define the terms of this debate. The syndrome clearly indicated that historians claim to a privileged role in shaping nation's identity that was popularly accepted in the 1970s and in the 1980s was no longer the case, and that it was actually the mass media which played a major role in defining the terms and condition of the public debate. Okay, so by the 1990s, the so-called rectification of history initiated by the South Korean government resulted in the indictment of two former presidents, Roh Tae-woo and Chun Doo-han, for their roles in the December 1979 coup and the suppression of the people of Gwangju in 1980, respectively. What appears to be swift action toward a fine moment for Korean democracy, unquote, however, needs further scrutiny as to its motives and its reputed historical and political significance. And this is all related to Park Chung-hee syndrome somehow, if I have time to go into all the details. The Kim Il-sung government's call for rectification of history emerged as part of the civilian government's much anticipated reform movement, which was carried out during the first years of his government. He took up the task, that is the task of the rectification of history, reluctantly and belatedly, however, as in Spain after the death of Franco, in which both sides of the Civil War tacitly agreed to put the past behind them and forget the traumatic history of the division of the Spanish people. Kim Il-sung actually initially called for reconciliation and declared that his government would not pursue insurrection charges against Roh Tae-woo and Chun Doo-han. Kim declared, quote, "It is proper to leave any unresolved issues to history of the future. There should not be any retaliatory event to satisfy one's grudge. Let us not forget history, but let us courageously forgive and reconcile," unquote. It was only after various groups, including those of the family members of the victims of the Gwangju massacre, put forth demands to find and punish those responsible for the suppression of Gwangju of 1980 1980, and after Kim's party suffered a major defeat in local elections, did Kim agree to rectify history. The subsequent special law on the Gwangju massacre made it possible to arrest 2 of the former presidents who were eventually sentenced to death but were given amnesty by Kim Dae-jung, who succeeded Kim Yong-sam. The change came about, that is the change on the part of Kim Yong-sam government, in part because Kim's government needed to distance itself from the followers of Park Chung-hee, with whose political party Kim's party had merged to achieve his political victory in the 1992 presidential election. The Kim government, the first civilian government to emerge after 30 years of military dictatorship, sought to highlight its departure from the previous authoritarian regimes by emphasizing, among other things, that its legitimacy rested in the past democratic events in history of Korea, such as the March 1st movement of 1919, the Shanghai Provisional Government during the colonial period, the April 19th student uprising of 1960, the May 18th Gwangju uprising of 1980, and the June uprising of 1987. The conservative mass media, backed by various conservative forces in Korean history, and here I'm using the term conservative in the same way that Professor Moon used, waged an open attack on this claim. Its counter-arguments stated that there is no such thing as an aberration or omission in history. That is, the legitimacy of the South Korean government rests on the anti-colonial movement during the Japanese occupation, the establishment, preservation, and defense of the nation state based on anti-communism, that is the first republic led by Syngman Rhee, its economic development led by Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, and democratization, that is the government led by No Tae-woo. Although this kind of argument had been voiced before, this time it was infused with confidence and vehemence that was previously missing. The worldwide changes of the late 1980s and early 1990s, particularly the breakdown of the existing socialism in Eastern Europe and sweeping globalization, added power to an otherwise old argument. At the same time, North Korea, who had pursued an autonomous and isolationist developmental policy, was hit by both human-made and natural disasters that plunged country into upheaval. South Korea had not only achieved an unprecedented economic development, but its state-led developmentalism had been touted as a model to be emulated in China, Southeast Asia, and many of the formerly socialist countries in Eastern Europe. The conservatives had become the voice of triumph in South Korea. So in this context, it was not surprising to see the intellectual community beset by shifting paradigms and shifting alignments. The previous tension between the so-called nationalist school and the people-oriented school in the field of Korean history, and I think this is a topic that Professor Im would talk about more, and between the modernization theory and autonomous development in the field of social science began to blur. There is clearly a sense among historians who are sympathetic to the cause of progressive movements in South Korea that the antagonistic structure of the intellectual and social paradigm that had previously existed in some sort of an equilibrium began to tilt advantageously toward the conservative position. Their voice is not only getting louder, but also more confident. Consequently, there is a growing sense or concern that the conflicts and confrontations surrounding historical interpretations are not merely academic issues, but rather point toward larger divisions in society, the division between those who have vested interests in the status quo and welcome the worldwide changes of globalization, neoliberalism occurring since the late 1980s, and those who see the need to change the status quo and worry about negative consequences of globalization and neoliberalism. For example, Kim Il-young, a political scientist, articulates this concern rather dramatically. Quote, "The hegemonic struggle for historical perspective can be a determining factor in our path for the future that is progressive through reform or retreat through compromise," unquote. I don't know how much time do I have.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay. So, obviously, I should conclude. Okay. So I guess we can talk more during the question and answer session. I have a lot more issues, but basically I would conclude saying that that at the heart of this debate about the Park Chung-hee syndrome was historical as well as moral and ethical assessment of Park Chung-hee. And to me, what is most significant and disturbing outcome of the Park Chung-hee syndrome is that the debate showed the related process by which the lines of moral judgments of authoritarian rule versus Park Chung-hee's achievement are blurred. So it's the blurring of the lines of distinction between authoritarianism and democracy that is of concern here. And so there I would end, and we can talk more about other issues. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Bryce Wakefield and the Woodrow Wilson Center for this invitation. I'm glad to be here and happy to take part in this conversation. My laptop is starting to act up. This is very scary. But, okay, I think it's going to work. Workshop that explicitly invites participants to reflect on South Korea's authoritarian past and its resonance in the present provides occasion for thinking about long-term historical trajectories. And that's what I would like to try to do in the time that I'm given. So with this, number of issues come immediately to mind for me. One, in thinking about South Korea's authoritarian past, past American support for authoritarian regimes in South Korea, and the logic of national security thinking that rationalized or justified support for those authoritarian dictatorial regimes. Here to give just one example. In February 1981, President Ronald Reagan, hosting his administration's first official state visit, welcomed President Chun Doo-hwan, who was mentioned already several times, and embraced him as a defender of freedom's frontier. I believe the term freedom's frontier, as the United States military's sobriquet for South Korea, goes much further back. But the defender of freedom's frontier in this case was the former South Korean Army General Chun Doo-hwan, who had come to power through a coup d'etat 14 months earlier in December 1979, who arrested his senior officers and brutally suppressed democracy demonstrators. And indeed, only 5 months later, in May 1980, was responsible for the massacre in the city of Gwangju that left hundreds dead. The prominence of the military in South Korean history and our memories of authoritarianism in South Korea being associated with intelligence agencies like the KCIA and the South Korean military had to do, of course, with the Korean War and the fact that only an armistice maintains a fragile peace even today. In historical terms, that is, as historical context for how we might understand authoritarianism in South Korea, we can say that in Korea, as in many other former colonies after World War II, it was the military and security agencies, specifically, in this case, the armed forces of the United States and the Army and the counterintelligence corps that it created in southern Korea after 1945. And the war that came to be waged 5 years later, the Korean War, it was these that created South Korea itself. That is to say, as was often the case in the age of decolonization, which coincided with the Cold War, post-colonial states were created through war. In other words, it was war that created these states. And this was especially true in the case of South Korea. At the ideological level, the justification for the creation of a separate state in southern Korea had to do with the American-led struggles against totalitarianism. And again, in historical terms, this critique of totalitarianism emerged as a disavowal of U.S. colonialism, rendering American intervention in former colonies like Korea as defense against communism, an act of rescue that reconfigured and redeployed earlier American racist and colonial discourses for the post-World War II context of decolonization and the Cold War. That is to say, the critique of totalitarianism was meant to domesticate and or replace or displace broad-based movements and discourses that had come out of years, if not decades, of anti-colonial struggle against Western colonial powers. The critique of totalitarianism, then, was meant to deflect criticism of American intervention and supremacy of American power in the Pacific Islands and in the East and Southeast Asia after World War II. That is, to disassociate American military presence from past colonialisms. This was truly a brutal and bloody history, not just in terms of wars like the Korean War, the war in Vietnam, and various counterinsurgency programs in Southeast Asia, but also in terms of fear at the level of everyday life and culture. In South Korea, under military dictatorships, you had censorship, curfew, military service for men, but also obligatory public declarations of loyalty to the state and denunciation of communism and denunciation of North Korea. Not just obedience, but also self-policing and self-censorship for writers, intellectuals, historians. All these aspects of authoritarianism that exacted a tremendous cost, not just at the level of culture, but also at the level of the psychic and emotional levels. My presentation today will focus on history writing. Because I'm a historian, I probably take history, more precisely history writing, historiography, too seriously. But I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that historiography, or history writing, especially narratives published as history textbooks and such, was a central part of both state-making and authoritarian practice. And so my presentation today has to be very schematic, and while telling the story of how history writing was central to both state-making and the struggle for democracy, I want to focus on the varieties of nationalism and nationalist histories as a way to explain why in South Korea today the left is associated with nationalism and the so-called new right finds affinity with post-colonial theories that are quite critical of nationalist narratives. And so you have seemingly an anomaly where the right in South Korea feels antipathy to nationalism. Now, because of time limitations, I will have to resort to labels to make it easier to keep track of things. So that is to say, while it might seem like for many that historians in South Korea are all nationalists, and that it was, but it's nationalism itself that provided the discursive terrain for the struggle against military dictatorships. The story would have to begin in the early 1960s with Lee Gi-baek. And here, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to prepare a handout for you, so it might be a bit difficult to keep track of these names. But the first historian to make reference to modernization theory that was being promoted by American academics and advisors at that time, late 1950s, early 1960s. Lee Gi-baek's work created a narrative framework for South Korea that was safely post-colonial. Safely post-colonial in the sense that it was anti-Japanese. And so it was critical of Japanese colonialism, and yet uncritical of American intervention in post-1945 Korea. It was a type of historiography that was like a type of hybrid between modernization theory and sort of a longer positivist tradition. And this quickly became the dominant mode of narrating South Korea's history in the context of the Korean War. The question of neocolonialism, the nature of American power or U.S. influence in South Korea, these were not mentioned, in fact suppressed by the anti-communist authoritarian state. And in this Lee Gi-baek's history too, then such questions would be sublimated through developmental time. South Korea, that is to say, South Korea developing with American assistance, but also from its own indigenous sources of modernity going back to the 18th century and so forth. As the effort to overcome Japanese colonialist historiography, such efforts gained momentum in the 1960s, a different group of historians like Kim Yong-sup, Kang Man-gil, began to sort of venture beyond the ideological boundaries imposed by South Korea's place in the Cold War system. And these historians, more radical historians, wrote a nationalist historiography that ventured beyond these boundaries, but still under the banner of nationalist historiography. So it was under a nationalist historiography then that such historians reestablished intellectual links to a older form of history writing that had been suppressed in post-1945 South Korea, a view of history that was based on nationalist, anti-colonial history writing. In a limited sense, these historians shared common ground with nationalist historians like Lee Gi-baek, who, writing in the mode of modernization theory, in the sense that for all of these historians, their effort was to write a Korea-centered history. But the political implications were obviously quite different. I'm going to skip here a bit. For these historians, Kim Yong-sup, Kang Man-gil, their historiography laid basis for the argument that actually, if we go back to starting in the late 19th century, there had been two possible paths to modernity: a relatively more egalitarian and autonomous path to modernity from below, with peasant rebellions providing the main impetus for progressive change, versus a more exploitative, dependent path to modernity from above, led by elites, many of whom were Christian, who would ultimately capitulate to colonial and imperialist demands in the 20th century. That is to say, these historians had located and what's actually radical about this, and quite subversive of modernization theory, was that these historians located the westernized and westernizing elites of the late 19th century within a historical trajectory that had roots in the colonial and cultural and political world of the landed class, and whose modernization efforts from the late 19th century onward reflected narrow class interests, and for that reason tended toward dependency on outside powers, ending ultimately with collaboration with the Japanese during the colonial period and with Americans after 1945. This then was a trajectory, this elitist, the trajectory led by elites, westernizing elites, that paved the way for Korea's colonization by Japan, formation of separate states in 1948, and dictatorship and dependent capitalist development in South Korea after 1948. Liberation in 1945, coming after decades of living under Japanese colonial rule, should have marked the beginning of a new history where the masses of people, the oppressed, could finally and rightly assume historical agency and become the subject of history. Instead, with partition along the 38th parallel, coming simultaneously with liberation, former collaborators and those willing to serve the new occupying powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, diverted history from its true path and brought about such terrible ordeal to the Korean people. And here meaning not just partition and the establishment of separate states, but this trajectory leading to the Korean War. For Kang Man-gil and others in the dissident writers and intellectuals, not only South Korea's official historiography, but much of academic writing, they argued, naturalized the present in the sense that they were written from within the structure of division. The historian's task then for Kang Man-gil was to write a history of modern Korea from a perspective that would be unfettered by this division. In other words, to have a kind of historical and political imagination that would be able to rewrite history that could sort of transcend the Cold War, basically, Cold War structures. This kind of history writing gained currency throughout the 1980s, and conservative historians became increasingly frustrated at this historiography that conceded or gave nationalist credentials to the left, including the leadership of North Korea, and seemingly denying historical legitimacy to South Korea. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989, dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, seemingly provided an opening, and so that the emergence of postmodern, postcolonial theory in Korean academic scholarship. The so-called New Right welcomed scholarship inspired by postcolonial theory for its refusal to narrate the colonial period, for example, as a kind of Manichaean struggle between a colonizing Japan that was racist and exploitative, opposed by a resisting and enduring Korean people or nation. With this, the New Right turned to criticism of nationalism in general, and 1980s nationalist historiography in particular, attacking this nationalist historiography for being critical of South Korea. I mean, it's in that context then that the New Right, the conservatives in South Korea today, are critical of nationalism. The scholars identified with the New Right charged that leftist nationalist historiography was responsible for a dangerously distorted historical perspective held by a sizable segment of the South Korean public, mostly the younger generation, as well as by the left-leaning Roh Moo-hyun administration, the administration previous to the current one. For these scholars, the New Right, leftist nationalist historiography had achieved near hegemony in politics, discouraging the publication of more objective scholarship with the privileging of nationalist struggles in the post-liberation period. Indeed, as the conservative Lee Myung-bak administration took office, some scholars associated with the New Right complained that scholars who now question this nationalist narrative face a backlash that is comparable to the anti-communist witch hunts of the past. The immediate political context in which to which these scholars were referring to had to do with the 20 or so truth commissions established by the National Assembly during both the Kim Dae-jung and Nomu현 administrations to investigate past wrongdoings, the rectification of the past movement that Namhee mentioned. Truth commissions looking into collaboration during the colonial period, to complicity in massacres and killings of civilians by both U.S. and South Korean military and police before, during, and after the Korean War. The New Right saw such investigations into the past as aimed at consolidating leftist hegemony and undermining South Korea's legitimacy through a one-sided attack or anti-communist on anti-communist conservatives in South Korea, because conservatives were much more likely to have had family members who had collaborated with the Japanese colonialists and close personal ties to authoritarian regimes of the past. That is to say, this is not abstract, this is very personal, and the consequences have to do not just with political death, but also the possible having to give up one's family fortunes. For example, land or such that their family had gained during the colonial period, for example. Thank you. So, in the conservative press, historical scholarship by the New Right was presented as a full-throated and much-needed critique of this leftist nationalist historiography. And so that the leading conservative newspaper in South Korea, Joseonilbo, has been at the forefront of criticizing nationalism and nationalist historiography and actively cultivating and supporting postmodern, post-colonial scholarship testifies to how much nationalism in South Korea had come to be associated with leftist politics and historiography. The New Right embraced post-colonial theory's critique of nationalism and nationalist historiography as totalizing and undemocratic, presented as a narrative, and they also presented themselves as victims at the hands of those who had led, actually, the movement for democracy throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Economic historians welcome post-colonial theory for subverting unities such as class and nation. And for the New Right, then, the alternative was to write a history that would recenter the individual, and as a way to restore legitimacy to South Korea's anti-communist legacy, now reconfigured as civilizational progress. Let me skip to the conclusion here. For the New Right, intensely anti-communist and fiercely unapologetic about capitalism and capitalist development in South Korea, accommodation with post-colonial scholarship is tactical, while the strategic target is leftist historiography and its political expression. Now, my presentation focused on history writing and why the struggle over history is central to both the democracy movement and the reconstitution of what Choi Jang-jae once referred to as the ruling bloc in contemporary South Korea. In addition to the continued application of national security law, harassment of NGOs, arrest or harassment of those who participate in various candlelight vigils since the Lee Myung-bak administration came to power, the struggle over how to write the history of South Korea's authoritarian past that continues today. And it's in that sense that the past is just as unpredictable as the future. That's my turn.
Alexis.
Do you want me to operate them?
I would love it if you would
Okay,
operate them, because there are two, here, there's two for each of you guys. Don't apologize for that.
Good afternoon. I too would like to thank the organizers and the Wilson Center for having us here. I confess, after 3 such profoundly interesting, textured, and thought-provoking discussions, I feel a bit like the optional sprinkles at the ice cream store. But I'm going to opt to go ahead and discuss the memory of Japan, but I'm going to be very specific in an example, and I'll come to it in a bit. I've taken so many notes during the past 3 talks that I can barely read my own paper, so forgive me if I start repeating words that you've just heard. They were so good. If you consider a number of South Korea's so-called best or greatest leaders, you get people such as King Sejong, Admiral Lee Sun-shin, Park Chung-hee, and I realize today's title involves solely South Korea, but for a minute, let's let North Korea into the room, since the people who live there are Korean too in history. And in the North, I'm thinking greatest hits leaders such as Kim Il-sung. And if you consider a so-called great hero that crosses the 38th parallel, you get An Jung-geun, the famous assassin in 1909, which is also the only possible way to remember October 26th. It's not just the mayoral election, it's the double whammy of assassination dates across the 20th century of Park Chung-hee and Ito Hirobumi. But then when you step back and think about these strong men together, with the exception of Sejong, of course, all these men are revered for their greatness in some way, somehow posited against a notion of Japan. And even if you really think about why Sejong is often summoned as such a great leader in cultural memory, and here, please understand, I'm going to quote Professor Moon's wonderful phantasmagoric usage of greatness, comic book terms, larger-than-life, outsized ways. Sejong claims greatness in many ways because of the so-called pure Korean cultural creations developed during his reign, i.e. those not tainted by other influences, but arguably most especially nothing Japanese, and the most important, of course, being Hangul, the writing system. And so, in short, these strong men across time in Korea are heroes in some way because they've defeated or bested Japan. And this is what I'd like to think briefly about, because I'd like to raise today the place that Japan holds as critical foil, the vital and without which we couldn't exist other, in the creation and legitimation specifically of South Korea during the post-colonial era, and why today we are in such a bind over what to make over Japan-South Korean relations right now. During the post-1945 era, and most especially noticeably during former Japanese Imperial Army Lieutenant President for Life Park Chung-hee's tenure, South Korean authoritarian rulers found much traction in the Japan as foil ruse in order to maintain and sometimes often whip up support for their own tenuous claims to power. Today, with if we call him authoritarian or wannabe strongman leader in Seoul, who keeps claiming that relations with Tokyo have never been better, yet continuously has to tend to the always seething cauldron of the so-called history problems, the contradictions involved in this ruse may boil over. And my own thinking, I believe this to be most possible with regards to the territorial dispute between Japan and Korea, Dokdo Takeshima. I've never been much one for psychological explanations. I believe they are deeply significant, yet I find them inherently impossible to prove. And if I try to argue for one, I come across as ignorant, and I really don't want to do that. So I'm just going to walk right around the problem of what people think and believe and show something that happened recently. And in this vein, I'd like, with your indulgence, to show a brief 2-minute clip from YouTube of a flash mob party that raced across South Korea on August 15th. And if we could crank up the volume, because this is the good part. August 15th, obviously, being Day of Light.
Sorry, I don't have...
That's great. There were a few other flash mobs that day, which are sort of quasi-planned online, quasi-spontaneous outbursts, but this was my favorite because it's a great combination of World Cup meets the March 1st, 1919. I know, it's better than my talk. And it had clear, demonstrable national spread. The colonial era costumes on young people leading the group in Daegu immediately smack of the first photograph that I've passed around of the March 1st, 1919 protests before the brutal crackdown happens later that day, that week, and becomes intensely awful. But who, if we look at the 1919 photograph of the women protesting in colonial clothing, who could imagine, though, and here I also am a historian, so one looks at 1919 pictures, and who could imagine that in less than 100 years, not that Koreans would be protesting Japan. Japan actually secured that privilege for itself on that particular day, but who could imagine that young women, Korean women in shorts, would be protesting with young men in shorts outside? I think many of us in this room are old enough to know that that in itself is a protest against authoritarianism in some way. But so what I want to get at, and I'm really intrigued by Namhee's crossover of authoritarianism and democracy, and I don't know where to go with it, but it's great. But what I want to point to is that though the contents of these moments is wholly different, the 1919 demonstrations are against actually occurring Japanese authoritarian brutality at the height of the authoritarianly brutal colonial era, while the 2011 moment summons the memory of that earlier era to summon a sense of solidarity today. And I could be wrong, but I've checked this clip a number of times, and I have not seen one person who could possibly have been alive during the colonial era participating in these 2011 protests. But although that content is wholly different in democratic South Korea today, the object of Japan remains very potent, and much more so around the question of Dokdo. And I believe this because in South Korea's post-Japan era, authoritarian rulers found particular value in these rocks as repositories of meaning, especially Syngman Rhee, under whose regime the rocks became defined as South Korean territory, and under Park Chung-hee as well, of course. And in these rocks, and I'm referring to them as rocks today, in these rocks, the strongmen had discovered a mechanism for releasing domestic steam that could potentially head against themselves. The problem, however, today over the rock issue, Dokdo Takashima, is arguably far more volatile and with far much more at stake than when these rocks initially got posited into Japan and Korea's relations. And I'm speaking, and I'm happy to talk about this after this discussion, but I'm speaking specifically about matters of EEZs and something called the continental shelf regime in Law of the Sea, which claim an enormous amount of national space underwater, insofar as for diplomats to give an inch on this issue actually now, by definition, means they're giving hundreds of miles of national space, which makes it a particularly fraught issue. And so where we are today, the problem with Dokdo, different from other issues of the so-called history problems, different especially from the former sex slaves of the Japanese Empire, and different from the matter of former slave labor, is that the islands themselves are relatively blank slates, devoid of human history, onto which today's participants on all sides and all generations can write narratives to suit their own version of the past in order to win the telling of the 20th century to take it forward into the 21st century future. Different, especially, for example, from the comfort women's history. The rocks are relatively free of complicated matters such as collaboration and complicity. As such, the island debates throughout the region, all of Japan's island problems, now stand as the preeminent marker with which to battle the past in the present. And you can really look at how China's leaders today are looking at how South Korea's leaders in the 50s and 60s used the R.O.Ks to set up similar discussions within China vis-a-vis Japan and the memory of Japan. So bringing it back to South Korea, where South Koreans can find vent to contemporary frustrations with their daily lives, maybe it's the economy, maybe it's not getting into college, in an open public space by dancing around happily, even though the underlying history is deeply tragic, singing, "We are Taehan Mingguk and we are great, get your hands and your words off of Dokdo, it's ours," the irredentist unification flag with a solid blue peninsula and an outsized island to the right could not be clearer. This land is our land. But as much fun as this all looks to be, it is arguably deeply problematic to the South Korean state, which generated this form of venting. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not discussing whether the islands are legitimately Japan's or Korea's. I actually think that's a separate question. But in terms of psychological things, having Dokdo have such a place of prominence now in public venting space is worth taking seriously. Because it is possible, I think, that in doing so, particularly under Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee's heavy hands, South Korea's authoritarian leaders have created possibly the nation's Achilles heel in an international setting. Syngman Rhee is obviously the first strongman to deploy Dokdo for his own presidential aspirational gains. And then Park Chung-hee, during the moment of negotiations over normalization with Japan in 1965, kind of got a sidetrack issue to take over the streets. And that's the second photograph I handed out, in which Park Chung-hee was essentially selling away the past by agreeing to the terms of normalization, structurally speaking, but diverted attention away from total protest against his regime into some people clamoring for get as much as you can out of the Rhee line, the peace line, as the fishing limit line. Don't sell away the fishermen. And in this instance, Park Chung-hee was actually able to spin some of the terms of the normalization treaty positively on the streets as the moment selling away the nation's past was happening in practice. And today this fraught problem finds rather odd traction under Lee Myung-bak, who infamously arrived in office and announced that he would not ask Japan for any more apologies, a statement that he immediately found he had to retract. And could you bring up the photograph I have on that piece of paper with him and for President Bush? Perhaps you all remember the summer of 2008 in which the Bureau of Geographic Names in Washington accidentally renamed the matter of Dokdo's sovereignty and put it out for anybody, essentially. When Condoleezza Rice is getting mid-flight phone calls, it's a seriously, it's an issue with different levels of traction, again, from the other history issues, of which this is now one component. En route to Beijing Olympics, President Bush, as you all know, stopped by in Seoul, where he was treated to a geography lesson at the Blue House. And I'm sure some of you have had the privilege of seeing this map, but you don't immediately notice Dokdo. But you do if you're getting a special tour. And so things could not have gotten stranger, I would argue, this past August, when 3 Japanese parliamentarians decided to lodge their own special interest group's displeasure over the June Korean Air Dokdo flyover to visit what they refer to as Takeshima on their own as so-called private citizens, which is, of course, how Japanese prime ministers describe their own visits to the notorious Yasukuni Shrine. South Korean government, no matter how overtly pro-Japanese it might be, And no matter how much it wants to take a pro-Japan posture, pro-US posture towards North Korea, found itself in a very strange position of having to sequester these 3 Japanese parliamentarians in the no man's land of the immigration pen at Incheon Airport, lest its failure to do so, or worse, its permission to let these Japanese public citizens visit Dokdo, which, let's bear in mind, is totally legal, and yet in effect, the government employees of the pro-Japanese Lee Myung-bak administration had to abduct, and here I think the word abduct is true, had to capture 3 sitting Japanese parliamentarians lest they traveled as tourists to a rock 1/15 the size of Central Park in New York, because in simplest terms, authoritarian regimes in post-1945 South Korea have cemented hating Japan at the center of safely holding South Korea together. There would be simply no conceivable way that President Lee could have stayed in power had his government not taken such an over-the-top approach of its own to this moment. And so, most simply put, while the island dispute can appear in some people's eyes to be the most manageable, more manageable than the living stories of the comfort women, for example, whose voices and scars destabilize all efforts to make neat the mess of Japan's authoritarian era in Korea, I would ask us to think about this tremendously precarious, potentially Falkland-esque issue on which to balance the stability and future of Northeast Asia. And I'll close with a little shorter but kind of folkier YouTube that my students currently enjoy. And obviously it's for an international audience because it's in English.
Right. Okay, thank you, Alexis. Right, as we've now got time for question and answers. As we're being webcast, we'll do this with microphones. If you could please state your name and any institutional affiliation you might have. Wait for the microphone, raise your hand, and state your name and any institutional affiliation you might have. Bob.
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Congratulations to all 4 of you for really entertaining and informative presentations. I have to say I've been at the Wilson Center for a long time now, but this is the first time I believe that flash mobs have entered into one of our sessions here. I'm tempted to ask 4 different questions to 4 of you, but I will restrain myself with a question to Professor M. I'm curious whether or not the fight you described between historians spilled over into larger society. I think, for instance, of various historiographical battles over, for instance, the nature of the New Deal or the validity of McCarthyism, or beginning in the 1960s, the nature of America's Cold War policies, how these struggles rather quickly became more than simply a battle over historical interpretations, and to an important degree really helped to shape society's understanding of some larger issues. Did anything like this take place in Korea, or were these arguments largely contained within the profession?
The arguments were not largely contained in the profession. The debates, the two speakers before me, I think discussed it quite at length. But to put it in the most sort of starkest terms, I guess, I mean, I think in the United States, we see that quite a lot. I mean, for example, over policy, the debates over the New Deal, or the debates over the Civil War and the American South, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the most starkest terms, the debate over 20th century history within South Korea, in the most darkest terms, goes to political legitimacy, legitimate historical agency, and sovereignty itself. Right, the legitimacy of either South Korea or North Korea, and so in some ways the stakes really could not be higher. Obviously, in the street demonstrations or whatnot, it wouldn't, explicitly be the struggle over historiography, but certainly, in political campaigns and whatnot, it's certainly there, quite consequential. And so, in that sense, I think the history, to put it very crudely, matters a lot more, I think, with much more consequences in South Korea today relative to, let's say, United States. Of course, it's consequential in the United States too. But
if I may amplify what Henry has talked about, I'd like to actually mention what one of the South Korean historians named Han Hong-gu talked about in relation to the possible cause of death of the former president Roh Moo-hyun. He basically attributes this struggle over rectification of history as one of the causes of Roh Moo-hyun's death. And let me sort of retrace as to why that is the case. The conservative elites in South Korean society has claimed that the years of both Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun administrations were the 10 lost years, lost decade, meaning that these two administrations had wasted their time talking about the past history or the rectification of history as opposed to moving forward, coming up with visions of future Korea, etc. And that's why they're referring to the past two administrations' time as lost decade. But if you think about one of the accomplishments of Roh Moo-hyun, despite all the failures that the left in South Korea attributes, there is accomplishment, and that is his fight over this rectification of history. Obviously, it was also during the Kim Dae-jung and Kim Il-sung period that these committees, Henry had mentioned about 20 different committees, truth and reconciliation commissions that had been created. However, it was actually during the Nomu현 era, that these commissions were able to activate in true sense. Because if you think about it, both Kim Il-sung and Kim Dae-jung government were born with what South Koreans label as congenital defects, meaning that they had to compromise with the ruling party in order to become presidents themselves. Kim Il-sung infamously merged his political party with the followers of the Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. And so from the very beginning, there were limits placed as to how he can rectify history, and which explains the reluctance of Kim Il-sung to go ahead with the trial, etc. Kim Dae-jung, despite the fact that he was one of the politicians who were purged and repressed by the Park Chung-hee, had to pledge during his campaign that he would actually establish Park Chung-hee Memorial Building if he were if he were elected. Again, trying to accommodate the wishes and aspirations of the conservative elite, and in fact had to conjoin with the conservative elements in order to become the president in 2003. Nomu현 was free of all these. Nomu현, in fact, was the first president in South Korea who was not aligning with any of the conservative forces in order for him to become the president. And as a result, he was the one who actually pushed through these legislative measures to go ahead with the rectification. And every step of the way, he was met with the fierce resistance by the conservative elite. And some of the examples that I can think of is the Constitutional Court that ruled against Nomu현's proposed plan to move the capital city. There are numerous examples as to how from the very beginning he met the fierce opposition and resistance from the conservative elite, and despite the fact that he was opposed, that he wanted to carry on with this rectification of history. And so just to amplify how that this issue is actually what, according to, again, the historian Han Hong-gu, drove to the death of Nomu현.
Anybody else? If not, I have one. Oh, well, I'm going to ask mine anyway. Now, I realize that apart from Sun Suk Moon here, you're all historians, but we have elections coming up next year. The legislative elections in South Korea, I believe, in April, and the presidential elections in December. I think I'm correct in that. I just wonder, do any of you have a sense as to how important this is in in party competition today? Obviously, with No, we had it was an incredibly divisive issue, nationalism versus a sort of acceptance of authoritarianism on the right. But are we likely to see that sort of arrangement of the political spectrum again? Does anybody have any sense that that's going to come through in electoral politics next year?
I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but just when I was following up this particular issue of Seoul mayoral by-election, this became really a major issue, although it's only a by-election, right? Just they are filling up the years that is left, although it's almost, more than 3 years, because, the political groups, the political parties and, NGOs behind, different parties, they really see this upcoming mayoral by-election as a sort of like, the first round in this elections that will take place next year, right? So it's so important for example, Democratic Party to win, this time, so that way they can really, prepare the field for victorious elections, for both general elections and the presidential election. And your question about whether there would be some kind of divisions, political divisions, playing out in this election. Am I
based on historical kind of lines?
Right.
Yeah.
I think definitely there will be alignment. The way I see this is Democratic Party is created by Nomu현. Political parties in South Korea for a long time have been more of instrument of political boss rather than institutionalized, organization for politics. So it's possible that, different individuals might, separate from the existing parties and create new party depending on their own calculation of what kind of the likelihood of their election. So I think it very much based on their own calculation of whether they would win or not, and I think that would really motivate first running the candidates, political figures to create new party or merge with somebody else. So it's in that sense, still very unpredictable. But I also see that there might be, perhaps, the public might have a bit more influence on political elites or political parties in general, because it's, after all, electoral democracy, and what people think and what people support really matters a great deal. So I think you see both persistence of this old way of doing politics in South Korea, but also ordinary people, being able to have some more influence, relatively speaking.
Great.
Could I just add one more thing?
Sure.
I think the short answer also just adding on to what Professor Moon has said earlier about the necessity to forget. These truth commissions, the leadership was replaced during Lee Myung-bak administration, and they're finishing up their work, released their final reports under the current administration. So in that sort of narrow sense, I think at least for the moment, for conservatives, the past is safely in the past.
Just wanted to say something quick about the new election. I think really the South Korea has witnessed the Korean people creating or charting a new, completely different political arena. I mean, the fact that Park Won-sun was elected without any kind of political party affiliation, and the fact that sort of progressive groups, or whatever label you put it, the oppositional groups or progressive groups, have come together and agreed on, in principle, that they would elect or that they would support the person who gets the most election from the primary, and that they actually went through this procedure. I think in itself speaks volumes about how many of the South Koreans are feeling dissatisfaction about the way that politics has been run with the current administration, and really trying to create a new sort of way of doing politics altogether. So I think it will be really interesting to see what happens, not only with the mayoral election, but the next presidential election.
Right.
My name is Jung-Hae Yu. I'd like to actually direct my question to Professor Moon in particular because it relates to or pertains to the by-election that's coming up. And you have sort of, perhaps I misunderstood, but kind of inferred to or referred to the Park Won-soon as being the Democratic Party sort of a, candidate. In sort of in a way, perhaps I may have misunderstood, but I guess my question is: Park Won-soon is independent candidate, however, got into sort of alliance with the Democratic Party to become a sort of won the primary as a sort of a candidate of the sort of a liberals, including the Democratic Party. My question on that is, as you look at rise of Park Won-soon very quickly on this particular by-election, and as we look at general election in April 2012 and the presidential election in December 2012, how do you then connect, or how do you interpret Park Won-soon's rise and what he represents as a sort of a political power as related to what you talked about as a social memory of the kind of a struggle that took place in perhaps response to now that Park Chung-hee syndrome has come up in last decade? Is this almost like the other sides representing? So perhaps I may not have made it clear, but I'd like for you to kind of try to connect, although there may not be causality, how do we read this and understand this as a part of much meta narrative that is taking place in front of us? Thank you.
About the first question, yeah, I didn't say he was the candidate for the Democratic Party. In fact, he is the outsider. He wasn't a politician. But as you mentioned, he was making an alliance with Democratic Party, and Democratic Party was also willing to do that because they didn't want to divide up votes later on, right? That's what happened when Kim Dae-jung was running against Kim Young-sam and other Kims, right? In back in 1992. So there was really sort of a broad agreement, on the opposition, broad sense. So he actually competed with the Park Young-sun, who was the DP candidate, and there was, the process of, selecting the unified candidate for the opposition, not just the Democratic Party, but the opposition, because they really want to prevent, the division of votes. And then the second point about the connection between collective memories of authoritarianism and the rise of Park Won-soon. The way I see the connection there is we need to look at the social groups who showed quite enthusiastic support for Park Won-soon. It was, they have been younger generation in their 20s and 30s. And people who are college educated and people who are white collar as opposed to blue collar workers. And also interestingly, a bit more men showed support, higher support for Park Won-soon than women. But the gender part, I didn't see sort of consistent poll results. But when it comes to, the generation, education, occupation, there were quite repeated results showing that these a majority of people in those social groupings show higher support for Park Won-soon, regardless of what kind of party they voted in earlier elections. And what I'm trying to argue here is that these were people who sort of developed what I call post-scarcity values. Certainly I didn't coin the term, but sociologists talked about this post-scarcity values as, kind of values that people develop when they reach certain level of education, certain level of, economic development. Certainly, I don't mean to some kind of, Maslow kind of, this kind of the hierarchy of needs, but empirically speaking, the economic developments in Korea for the past few decades, and also the social change, particularly characterized by the, rise of higher education, especially in the 80s and 90s. So there was really multiplication of college graduates in South Korea in the 80s and 90s, along with, the rising standard of living. And also 90s and 2000, there were sort of a conservative democratization, right? I mean, there were all these limitations that other people mentioned, but it was nevertheless democratization. And in that process, starting from particularly late 1980s, the workers of, the manufacturing and service industry, many of them are organized, and if they are not, they were definitely influenced by ongoing movement, right, to really organize democratic labor union and then really, demand their rights. So these are sort of very different social groups, and they are concerned about issues other than just eating and material comfort. They care about qualities of living, and then these are people who sort of embrace critical memory of Park Chung-hee, and then they embrace Roh-moo-yeon as a sort of like symbol of the egalitarian democratic president. So I think there is a connection between this social group who embrace a certain kind of memories about authoritarianism in the past, and their political orientation, on a particular issue, right? So in that sense, I think there is a certain quite meaningful continuity or connections between social memories, right, constantly produced, circulating, and consumed, and presence of these groups who are acting certain way, on particular social issues or political issues. So that's the sort of connection that I was trying to make.
Okay, I'm terribly sorry, but we've run out of time. And if you'd like to join me in thanking our guests today for what has been an informative session.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I guess an administration like Lux administration.
Especially if you live in Jeju-do.
Yes.
Enjoyed your presentation.
I'm sorry.
What I wanted you to do.
Because it's very rare.
The lines between the battle with